The Kluane mountain ranges, like giant sentinels, have long guarded their sister peaks of the St. Elias from the eyes of all but a few. Behind the rim of these ranges, less than 50 miles from here, lies a land of ice and snow, and amidst the solitude and silence, Mount Logan, Canada's highest mountain. From the beginning of time, man has been drawn to the unknown, to be the first to see what others may never see. For many, the attraction of the mountains has been like a magnet, impossible to resist. In 1897, an Italian expedition was in the St. Elias and took the first photographs of Canada's highest mountain, Mount Logan. "28 years later, in 1925, a joint Canadian-American expedition was underway. Traveling to the town of McCarthy via Cordova, Alaska, then via the Chitna River, they made their way to open ice. Of the original team, 1 would stop at the timberline and 8 continue with the ascent. Of these, only 6 would make a bid for the summit, and before the ordeal was over, 4 would owe their lives to their companions. This is an account of the climb and of Norman Reed's part in the conquest.
I'm somewhat humbled to be here this evening. We are celebrating many anniversaries here today. 100th birthday of Canada's national parks, the 60th anniversary of the first ascent on Mount Logan, and the 50th anniversary of 2 major scientific expeditions of Dr. Wood and Dr. Washburn. And it came to me the other day...
Amidst a host of guests and pioneers, Mount Logan's first ascent was celebrated by Parks Canada at Yukon's Kluane National Park. The 1925 First Ascent team was drawn from across the North American continent. In the case of surviving member Norman Reed, the call of America's maritime East Coast readily gave way to that of Yukon's mountains. In the mid-1920s, traveling 4,000 miles across the continent offered challenge enough for most. But this intrepid contingent bravely boarded the West Coast steamer, bypassing Skagway's proven route to the interior, and struck out to Cordova, Alaska. Regrettably, Norman Reed, now 94, was unable to attend the reunion. However, 2 internationally recognized mountaineers, Bradford Washburn and Walter Wood, talked with Yukon colleague Monty Alford about the historical ascent.
It was always my impression from friends of mine like Henry Hall, who was on the mountain, and Fred Lambert, also was the second in command, that the idea developed around the campfire after both of them had made the ascent of Mount Robson. And presumably in 1923, we'll say. Yes. Because it would have taken at least a year to organize this. And the concept was to have a joint American-Canadian team take on the highest mountain in Canada.
Brad, can you take us a little further, past the beginnings, maybe to the reconnaissance that was made in 1924. I understand that it was necessary to relay supplies for the 1925 ascent.
Well, all I remember was that I knew Bob Morgan intimately, and of course I know Henry Hall well, and I know Norman Reed well. In fact, Norman Reed sent his best to everybody up here in the Yukon. After we saw him last week, he had a tiny cerebral accident, as they call it now, that messed things up, and he didn't dare come here. He's 94 years old, and he's just spent the winter skiing in Switzerland at 94. But after these early beginnings, it was determined that probably the best way to go into Logan was through Alaska, approaching it up the Chittenah Valley through McCarthy. And you recollect at that time the big copper mine at Kennecott, which is just at McCarthy in Alaska, was going full blast. Also, there was a railroad that got you in that far.
Yes.
And Andy Taylor had been selected. I don't know who selected Andy. Do you recollect, Walter?
I have no idea. I assume that he probably came from Fred Lambert.
Probably. Well, Andy Taylor at that time was 50 years old. I guess he was the oldest member of the party. He was tough as nails, an absolutely wonderful guy who dog teamed, came from Ottawa, dog teamed all through the gold rush days. So he knew winter, Canada, and the Yukon well. He was strong, and he knew how to operate on the trail in cold weather. And remember, they had the Boundary Commission maps, which the strip of which, the international boundary, you see, goes right through this area. So that there were really pretty good maps of the lower Chittenah and Logan glaciers. And McCarthy, let's see, was McCarthy and was a
Taylor.
very, very powerful guy, and Andy went in with dog teams in the middle of the winter, or the spring of 925, and put a big cache of equipment way up the Logan Glacier, near where the Ogilvie Glacier comes into it, and then retired. And then they all came back in the spring as a party, and moved relatively rapidly up the Chittenah Valley on foot, no air support, no helicopters, no radio, none of that, and got into this big cache. And then at that point, and we can show this better maybe with a picture or two, because there's some pretty good pictures and maps now, which didn't exist in those days. They proceeded in the old-fashioned way. This was, I think, Walter, you would agree with me, that this is more of a polar expedition in 3 dimensions than what you or I would call a mountain ascent. Because, you know, this route is technically a cinch.
That's right.
But it's long and it's cold. And I like this description of things being a polar expedition in 3 dimensions, because the problem is snowshoes. Very few people use skis then. Wallowing around up steep slopes, up to your neck in snow in places, and extreme cold, very, very cold. And they managed to work their way up the Ogilvie Glacier to its pass, which is called King Call, which is a high spot. How high was that?
13.5.
Yeah. And then there's a nifty little side hill that leads you right up to the first of Logan's many peaks. You have to get the feeling of Logan as not being a mountain like that. It is a mountain like this that comes up and is horizontal, and nearly 10 miles of that peak are over 18,000 feet high, all the way along. You can't get below 18,000. And there's a series of lesser peaks. And this reminds one a little of that wonderful quote from Robert Browning, "Oh, those mountains, their infinite movement, ever some new head and breast of them thrusts into view to deceive the intruder." And that's what every one of these peaks of Logan, you think the next one's the top. And it was an enormous tour de force to have this party move across all of these peaks, all of which are over 17,000 feet high.
Remember that at 18,000 foot level of Mount Logan is 10 miles long. And therefore you've got 10 miles to traverse in one direction and 10 miles to traverse back in the other, which is enough of a walk on a nice day like today, rather than consider what it must have been like up there. The second thing is that, and it's so important, in those days, equipment was nothing like what it is today. Brad has described the very best equipment people could use in situations like that, but they did not know what those conditions would be when they got to 17 or 18,000 feet on Logan. We now know from work that has been done under the Icefield Ranges Research Project on Logan that the mean average temperature of the snow at 17,000 feet is -3 degrees the year round. So that you're walking along a surface which is at least -3 degrees at an air temperature which is probably minus, and a wind chill factor which is going to put you down to -40, -50.
And finally, here it is written on this wonderful old ice axe of Norman Reed's that has been either given or loaned to us here, on June 23, 1925, at 8:30 p.m., they reached the summit of Logan. It was very, very cold, about 30 below zero, and it was very clear to Reed and his companions, the fellows who knew their stuff on Yukon weather. Both Andy and Norman Reed said, we're in for a hell of a storm, and it's night, and we've got to get out of here. And they had to drop down into a pass, which was it, 500-600 feet below, 500 feet anyway, below the top. But one of the members of the party got down into that pass after climbing for hours and hours and hours. And he said, I've had it, fellas, I can't go any further. And to put it in very simple English, this was a hell of a situation. Because here these guys were at over 18,000 feet in the middle of the night. And there was no way they could get back up this slope together. And at this point, Andy Taylor and Norman Reed did take charge. And they had brought with them willow twigs and stuck them in every 100 feet all the way so that if they got caught in a storm, they could find their way back through this wilderness of drifting snow. And they had run out of these things because none of them had any idea how long that ridge was going to be. So there were no more willow twigs to a point about a quarter of a mile below the top of the second peak. So these two fellows, who were the only two who really had much pep left, went up that peak while the others wallowed up it to locate that first willow wand, because if they didn't locate it, the whole bunch of them were in trouble. And the clouds were coming down. They got to the willow wand. Andy Taylor and Reed were there, and then they had to go back up again a couple of 100 yards to the top of the second peak to meet the other guys who were coming up very slowly to it. And they met them on top as the storm hit, and then you couldn't see anything. They stopped and they had a bite to eat, raisins or something to keep them going. And then there was a great argument as to which way they were going to go. And going down the way the majority wanted to go was back up Logan. And the minority, who were stronger and talked louder, thank God, won the battle. And they said, look, fellas, we don't give a damn where you're going. We're going this way. And Andy Taylor and Reed's leadership turned them all the other way, which was the way out, and saved the whole party.
Apart from the South Polar ice cap and that of Greenland, this region is the most intensely glaciated in the world, a land of solitude and silence. It was in 1950, during the heyday of 3D movies and post-war prosperity, that Norman Reed, then 60, with one other companion, returned to the icefield ranges and made his second ascent of Mount Logan. Ten years later, the Icefield Ranges Research Project established its base on the shores of Lake Kluane. The abandoned World War II airstrip had a new lease on life, and the Helio Courier aircraft replaced the pack train. Weather permitting, mountaineers today still take advantage of the base facilities and fly to Mount Logan in less than an hour. The advance freight party for the 25 ascent pulled out of McCarthy, Alaska with close to 10 tons of supplies and equipment, of which over half were consumed during the process of establishing the advance base camp. Once established, the mountaineers now retraced the steps of the freight party and spent a further 2 weeks in the process. Today, in stark contrast, a similar-sized team can fly out of the Institute's airstrip and have their base camp set up in a day. Long past is the romantic notion that dog teams are an effective means of logistic support. Was it just 60 years ago that Norman Reed and his companions trekked to Logan for the first
Harper,
time?
if you care to make the presentation, please.
This certificate reads, presented to Norman H. Reed in honor of his membership on the 60th anniversary of the ascent of Mount Logan in 1925 and leader 35th anniversary of the second ascent at Mount Logan in 1950. And it's my pleasure to present this to Dr. Washburn so he can take it back to Dr. Reed with our best wishes.
Thank you very, very much. When we saw Norm Reed just a week ago, he was just terribly sorry he couldn't make it. In fact, he wanted to come. If the doctor hadn't messed things up, he'd be here. But there are very few of us who might live to 94 who can speak as easily and as precisely as he can today. And Barbara and I will deliver this to him in about 10 days, right down in Essex where he lives.
Thank you very much. Thank you both.
Boston, home of the famous Tea Party, is still home for Norman Reed, as it was for his two companions, Hall and Morgan. In the mid-20s, the East Coast was the springboard for at least two major conquests. In 27, just south of here, Charles Lindbergh left New York on his record-breaking flight to Paris. 2 years before, Norman Reed and his two Boston companions left here to participate in the record ascent of Yukon's Mount Logan. Boston's Museum of Science is home away from home for its chairman, longtime director Bradford Washburn.
He gave Andy a 35-pound load. He would go along on his snowshoes hour after hour and never wear down. It's a real pleasure to welcome an old friend and a very distinguished early visitor to both the Yukon and Alaska, to Boston's Museum of Science. It's Norman Reed of, where would you say, Norman, is your headquarters? Because I know
I'm a wandering bachelor.
He's everywhere.
I'm everywhere.
You're 94 years old.
94 and a half.
And
halfway to finish the 95th.
And I think we should review a word or two about the difference between the first trip and the second. Now, the first was a major assault by a big group of people, and the second was a two-man tour de force.
Well, the second time, when the first time we went up from King Cole up, the glacier was broken up in terrible big seracs. We didn't think we would find a way to get over them because they were bent over like this. You see, we couldn't climb over this way. And the second time, it was as smooth as the best skiing field you ever saw in your life. Now, how in 25 years that could change like that, I don't know.
Now, how high did you go with skis in 950?
I don't remember, but you could have gone right to the top of the mountain.
Now, another thing that is going on today, now, because now you're looking back 60 years or 35 years, is equipment. What was the equipment that you used then instead of felt boots and down jackets and all the fancy equipment?
Everybody arrived with his own equipment, and they didn't have any standard equipment. And I think that we used those little Baka rubber bottom boots.
What do you call them, shoe packs in the Arctic?
Yeah, shoe packs. And we just stuffed them full of stingray. And I think I had ordinary underclothes on, and then two heavy suits of underclothes, then a flannel shirt, and then 2 sweaters, and then the big heavy parka.
And the parka still, though, in those days was just a windproof,
It was a windproof.
rather than something that
yeah,
had
that was
insulation.
a windproof.
An avid photographer himself, Brad expressed his admiration for the unsung efforts of the Mount Logan photographer.
But this was taken with 35mm commercial film in 1925. And believe me, that was quite a business. And who on earth took the camera all the way to the top of that mountain and made those pictures?
Carpe.
Alan Carpe.
Yeah, Carpe took most of the pictures. Of course, Lambert had well, that was a still camera. He had a still camera with him all the time. He took a lot of the still pictures. But Carpe took that. That's it was a wonderful stunt of Carpe and Lambert and their condition, physical condition, to just the determination to make the top, and they did. They were finished, but I thought that on the way down, after we got the top, we could have gone back up, or most of us could have, at the 1,000-foot slope, but Lambert was falling on his face every 2 or 3 steps, and we thought he was going to die right then.
Yeah, they were really,
we thought Lambert was finished, and so we had to dig holes in the snow. We didn't have any sleeping bags or tents or anything, and covered, with the snow. It was extraordinary how quickly warm you were with this blanket of snow over you. And I had a parka over me. So the next day when I took the parka off, the moisture from the inside and the cold on the outside froze that parka, and I just stood it up like a tent. Just about to start, I saw the storm coming over Logan, and we'd run out of sticks, willow sticks, some distance down on the other side of the first peak.
Let me remark at this point that in the good old days, and I might add today, anybody who knows what they're doing on a mountain like Logan or McKinley will bring what used to be called willow wands. They were willow shoots about a yard long, and you'd stick them in the snow every 100 feet or so, so if you got caught in a whiteout or a blizzard, you could find your way back to camp. And when they made this first ascent of Logan, they ran out of willow wands, having really no conception of how long the ridge of Logan is. And the last, Norman, it must have been half a mile. You had no willow wands.
Oh, no, we didn't have any willow wands from the top back up to the feet, and then down to this, some distance down the side, the first false peak. You see, when we thought we saw the top of Logan, and it wasn't very far away. When we got up the top, there was Logan 4 miles away and much higher.
Yeah.
And so we ran out of these last triggers, and I knew where it was, stuck, but that storm was coming fast, you see. I knew the whiteout would be there, so I rushed up to get and locate it. So I got up there in time, took my ice axe and pointed the thing in the direction of it, and then climbed back up to the falls peak for the others. And then the others were, I don't know what they got completely bamboozled, lost.
I think you can get easily disoriented in a big blizzard.
Instead of going up the way I did, that you were right straight up, you know, the steep slope about 1,000 feet. They started slabbing along the side. Well, if they'd kept on going, they would have either gone over the precipice or had to spend the night in another snow. I don't think Lambert and Carpe could have spent another night. And but I got up there, I could see them, and I worked my way along the peak where there was an opening in it, and where I could see them again, and I yelled and yelled, because they couldn't hear me. And Carpe just happened to look up and saw me.
All too soon, the long-awaited meeting came to an end, and it was time for Brad to present the certificate of the Pioneers of St. Elias to Norman Reed.
And it says here, member the 60th anniversary of the first ascent of Mount Logan in 925, and leader of the 35th anniversary of the second ascent of Mount Logan in 1950. And it's great to be able to give it to you.
I accept it with great pleasure, and I'm only sorry that the other 5 couldn't be with us who made the talk.
Largely due to the efforts of Reed and Taylor, all 6 eventually arrived at the 18,500-foot camp and took shelter in the lee of the granite crags. The descent over, Cascades Camp afforded a welcome respite from the ordeal and an opportunity to dress frozen fingers. And best of all, a 2-day celebration, dining on every conceivable delicacy that the genius of man had contrived to put in a can. The final leg of their journey was via the Chitna River. However, the original plans, which called for the construction of 2 boats, soon gave way to the construction of 2 rafts. Five logs wide and 16 feet long, the rafts were launched on July 11th. Another exciting journey was about to begin. The swift-flowing Chitna was not without its challenge. On July 13th, 2 months since their departure, they walked into the town of McCarthy. The expedition was over. Canada's highest mountain had been scaled for the first time.